Good afternoon and welcome to the City Club of Eugene's October 25th, 2024 program, Ghosts of Oregon's History. My name is Andrew Kalk and I am City Club's president. We're coming to you from our home at the historic Wow Hall in the heart of downtown Eugene, and it's my pleasure to extend a warm welcome to our speaker and to all of you joining us in person, online, and over the radio. Since 1990, City Club has been dedicated to our founding mission, to build community vision through open inquiry. In accordance with our mission and purpose, we hope to help connect people throughout our community and across generations, identities, experiences, and perspectives, perhaps even the afterlife today. You are invited this week and every week to join us in this effort, to share your wisdom, to learn something new, and to take active steps to make a difference in this city and region that we love. Of course, we cannot do this work alone, so a special thank you to our Platinum, Community, and Diamond sponsors. The Eugene Area Chamber of Commerce, serving as a catalytic leader in creating a vibrant and diverse economy that drives economic opportunity and well-being. Kaiser Permanente, which exists to provide high-quality, affordable healthcare services and to improve the health of our members and the communities we serve. More information at www.kp.org. The University of Oregon has helped Oregonians question critically, think logically, reason effectively, communicate clearly, act creatively, and live ethically since 1876. More information at uoregon.edu. Lane Community College transforms lives through learning. LCC provides comprehensive, accessible, high-quality educational opportunities that promote student success. For more information, visit lanecc.edu. And thank you to the City of Eugene and to Lane County for their support as well. With that, I'm happy to turn the mic over to Mary Layton, the coordinator of today's program, to introduce our topic and our speaker. Mary.
That's Sherlock to you, Andrew. As Halloween approaches, those familiar with Oregon history might harbor an eerie yen to meet the specters of certain remarkable people. How would Sheriff W.W. Withers, famous for his extraordinary kindness, describe the final moments before his tragic end? What is the view from the wild blue yonder for Hazel Ying Lee, the first female fighter pilot in the United States? How would Laura Stockton Starcher, the first female mayor in the U.S., feel about her legacy today? Fern Hobbs is one of my favorites. She was an emissary of Governor Oswald West and became the highest paid civil servant of her times. How did it feel to clean up the most notorious and vice-ridden town in Oregon in 1908 by declaring martial law? Then there were the folks whose ghosts are best left undisturbed. The recent remodel of Lane County History Museum revealed previously unseen files of Lane County coroner's reports from 1860 to 1913, stored in the last 3 boxes to be unpacked for the renovation. In this program, local historian and writer Jennifer Chambers will tell some of the stories in these boxes and describe people she has learned about through her study of Oregon history. She will tell us which ones she would love to meet as apparitions and which she will be sure to avoid. Jennifer is a writer, speaker, and host of Same Crime, Different Time and Resilient with Jen Chambers podcasts. A former columnist and co-owner of a publishing company, she attended the University of Iowa summer writing program and has spoken at conferences across the United States. After surviving a traumatic brain injury that erased her memory before age 15, she relearned everything from walking to speaking. In addition to writing history and fantasy books, she serves on the boards of Lane Library League and the Fern Ridge Public Library. Jennifer, we eagerly await your introduction to the ghosts.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me today. Hello, everyone. I am very excited to talk about Oregon history. I've spent a lot of my lifetime learning about these amazing stories from Oregon's past. These are people whose lives still echo through time, some in ways that are inspiring, and others in ways that remind us of the darkness that history can hold. I've titled this talk Ghosts of Oregon History Some I wish that I could meet, and a few I'm glad I didn't, because the past has a way of haunting us, not just through spectral apparitions, but through the legacy of their lives and their actions. A few of the ones I'd like to meet are the ones I'm going to speak about first. And the very first is Eliza Young. She was falsely known as the last Kalapuya woman. Eliza Young is remembered as the last known member of the Kalapuya tribe in the Brownsville, Oregon area, although that's a bit of a misnomer. Local lore tells us that she haunts her grave, serving as a poignant reminder of the loss and resilience of the Kalapuya people who thrived here long before settlers arrived. To understand Eliza's story, first we need to look at the Kalapuya people themselves. For thousands of years, they lived in harmony here with the land in the Willamette Valley, using the resources wisely and holding a deep spiritual connection to the area. They were resourceful, known for their beautiful basketry, and a unique system of land management, where they used controlled burns to maintain the grasslands, which of course provided ideal hunting grounds. But in the early 1800s, everything changed. With the arrival of European settlers, of course, they also brought devastating diseases like malaria and smallpox that wiped out much of the Kalapuya population. By the mid-19th century, only a fraction of the Kalapuya remained. Soon after, government policies like the Oregon Donation Land Act of 1850 pushed them off of their ancestral lands. And amid all of this, Eliza Young was born. We don't know her actual age, so we don't know exactly what year she was born, but she appears to have been born in the late 1830s and then orphaned, possibly as diseases wiped out entire towns. She was then, I would have to say that I don't have an exact fact on this, but I know that she has been said to have been used as a slave by other tribes. I can't verify that, but I can verify that she was adopted in the 1840s by a settler family, the Jacob Spores family, where she was mainly used as a servant. She later married twice, and she had 2 children, both of whom died. By the time she passed away in 1936, she was one of the last fluent speakers thought to be still alive speaking the Kalapuya language, and also thought at that time to be among the final members of her tribe in the region. She lived in the Brownsville community for most of her adult life. She was well known for her artistry with making baskets, and she supported herself by making these baskets. Interestingly, she continued to make them after she became blind, and the community of Brownsville supported her and gave her a cabin, and she lived there until her death. She was, of course, definitely not the last Kalapuya in existence, as several hundred Kalapuya lived elsewhere at the time of her death, and researchers from the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde, where Kalapuyan citizens are often enrolled today, found in 2024 that native speakers lived until 1971. In Brownsville, she became somewhat of a legend. People loved her in the town and continued to revere her memory, but her grave at the Brownsville Cemetery is where her story takes a mysterious turn. After her death, stories spread about ghostly sightings near her burial place. People spoke of cold spots, strange footsteps behind them, and even a shadowy figure moving among the trees, all signs that they believed were Eliza's lingering presence. Some say that Eliza is still there, but they also interestingly say that her ghost wasn't one of anger. According to those who are reported to have seen her, it's thought to be more of a sorrowful presence. Her haunting raises a larger question, too, about how we remember history and whose stories are told. The Kalapuya were nearly erased from historical record, along with her language and culture, but Eliza's life, and perhaps even her ghost, live on in memory in Brownsville. In recent years, efforts have grown to preserve the Kalapuya language and honor their cultural legacy, and local tribes and historians are working to ensure that this isn't forgotten. Much of this story that I know is thanks to the research done by the Linn County Historic History Museum and the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde, so I very much appreciate their research so that I could learn this. If I could meet Eliza, I would love to hear her stories firsthand. learn about her life. I would love to learn about how she could make such beauty in the face of such strife and such a difficult time she must have had. And I would love to learn about how even after she became blind, she was able to make her beautiful art and then honor her as a keeper of her history that almost disappeared. Now, the story that Mary is talking about Sheriff W.W. Withers, is one of my favorite ones to tell. I was very lucky. I have a friendship with a woman who works at the Lane County History Museum, Robin Myers. I was doing a talk there about one of my books last year, and she caught me after the talk and said, I have this really interesting story that I want to learn the end of, so I would love for you to research this if you're interested. And she brought me over to a portrait on the wall. And I would love for you to visit the Lane County History Museum. They're wonderful. It's a wonderful museum. If you walk inside, this portrait will be on your left right after you enter. You'll see it. It's a very large sepia tone portrait of a very handsome man with a glorious handlebar mustache and very kind, I think, looking dark eyes. Robin told me the story of how she found the research that I've been using. They had remade the museum last year, so they'd packed everything up in boxes. And one of the first things that Robin brought back out was this portrait, but she didn't know who it was because there was no name attached. So she put him up on the mantle, and she really enjoyed talking to him while she was putting things away, and she thought that he was really, kind and fun. And interestingly enough, other people who worked there didn't like it. What she thought were kind eyes, they thought were kind of like those posters where the eyes track you when you're walking across the room. So they thought that he was creepy. And we still didn't know who he was, but she kept unpacking the boxes until they were about 3 from the end. And then in the 3rd from the last box or so, she pulled out his name tag that clearly went with his portrait, so she could put it next to him, and she was happy to have him named. And in the next box, she pulls out a small white bag, which she poured into her hand, and it was rope cut from the noose of the man who killed Sheriff W.W. Withers. So she had to know what happened, and she kept unpacking boxes. And in the last box, she found a transcript of a person's experience who was there both when Sheriff Withers' killer was caught and when he was hung. So the story was set, and I had to find out the rest. I needed to know. So that became the centerpiece for one of my research projects. But I was so thankful to Robin, and I got to learn all about Sheriff W.W. Withers. I mean, starting with his name and that mustache. He's incredible. His name is William Wallace Withers. He was born in 1846. And he grew up in the rapidly developing frontier here of the Pacific Northwest. His family was a pioneer family. And even at a young age, he showed a knack for justice and leadership and camaraderie. People really liked him. And then as the population of Eugene expanded, so did the crime rate, which I'm sure he noticed, because by the 1870s, he was really drawn to law enforcement. Then Eugene, of course, was growing and turbulent. It had all of the hallmarks of the West at that time: saloons, gambling, outlaw gangs, and law enforcement often found themselves outmanned and outgunned. In 1876, W.W. Withers was appointed as the sheriff of Lane County. He soon developed a reputation for being tough but fair, but he wasn't just known for his gun skills, although they were impressive. His leadership and his dedication were things that I read about again and again that people really revered and remembered in Sheriff Withers. His respect for both his colleagues and the community was kind of a marvel. He solved high-profile cases. Yes, he solved jewel thieves and robberies and things like that. But also his softer side really showed. There are many, many newspaper articles that you can see in the historical record about Sheriff Withers taking his own time to take members of the community who were widowed to go visit their relatives, either in the state prison or in the state mental hospital just because they didn't have any other way to get there. He was always known as a very kind man. It was a cold February night in 1891 when Sheriff Withers was murdered. He received a tip that day that would change everything. He and the sheriff's department had been on the trail of a fugitive named Elliot Lyons. Elliot was a horse thief and a long-standing rascal who was wanted for murder. His family lived in Walton, Oregon, and kind of at his last resort, he was running to his family's home to hide out. And that was the tip that Sheriff Withers was given. He was determined to bring him to justice, just like he was determined with every other aspect of his life. He gathered a small posse, and the posse included his next-door neighbor, whose son tagged along, and that's whose record we have, because he remembered and recorded his experience of the day. The posse surrounded the home, crept up the hill in Walton, and surrounded the home in a semicircle. Sheriff Withers was at the side door, and he was about to look up into the window when the door opened, and Lyons' wife came out, and she was about ready to dump out the dirty dishwater. Instead, Lyons almost so quickly, it was almost like you could see it in a movie, just like a flash, he grabbed Sheriff Withers, and he and his family restrained Sheriff Withers inside. Before the other deputies could get inside, they heard a gunshot. And as they opened the door, they found Sheriff Withers was shot, and Lyons escaped. Of course, everyone was absolutely incredulous and brought Sheriff Withers into town. He had to be taken on a wagon. It took a very long time, and he unfortunately died that day. But he was able to give them some information about Lyons. They were able to catch Lyons as he was trying to board a train in Cresswell, actually, and he eventually was sentenced to be hung. So I would love to meet Sheriff Withers. How did he manage the balance of justice and survival and still being a kind man in such a volatile time in Oregon's history? I was also kind of incredulous that I didn't know more about him. And now every time I go to the museum, I'll look at his portrait because he seems like such a nice guy. The next person I want to talk about is someone who is a woman in Oregon history that I thought that I should have known about growing up here. There are a lot of Oregon women that did really remarkable things, and as a person who grew up here, I thought it was just a shame that they weren't more known. Hazel Ying Lee, who is from Portland actually, was the nation's first Chinese-American fighter pilot that was a female, and she broke racial and gender barriers. She was born in 1912 as one of 8 kids. Her family were Chinese immigrants to Portland, and they worked hard to give her and her family a really good life. She became interested in aviation really early, and her parents supported this, and her whole community supported it. So she worked as an elevator operator in a department store so that she had enough money to take flying lessons privately. And she was an accomplished pilot by the time she was 19. Back in 1930. In 1932, the Japanese invaded China, and like many Chinese Americans, she and her family wanted to travel to China to join the Chinese Air Force to help defeat Japan. But after she got there, she found out that they wouldn't take female pilots. But she was undeterred. She piloted in China on a commercial airplane for quite a while and became very accomplished. She had a couple of near misses where she hid out in the belly of her plane. And she eventually made her way back to the United States by 1942. She had one of her dreams come true when she was accepted to the Women's Air Force Service Pilots, or the WASPs, in 1943, and she trained with them in Texas. She learned to fly all kinds of military planes. She was later stationed in Michigan, where she ferried planes for the men to take overseas to fly in war. But she learned, I have to be very careful, there are so many planes that she learned. She learned how to pilot a Stearman PT-17, a North American T-6 Texan, and the Boeing C-47, which could transport up to 6,000 pounds of cargo. And even better than that, later she was one of very few women who learned how to pilot the P-51 Mustang. At this time, just awful. Female pilots, and I'm sure you're not surprised, made much less than male pilots. But I was pretty incredulous to learn that they had to pay their own room and board, and they had no benefits. They had to pass the hat if one of them was injured or died in the line of duty, and they had to buy their own uniforms. But they continued. Hazel was such a good pilot that in her career she only had 2 forced landings. One of them was pretty extraordinary. She was ferrying a plane and had to make an emergency landing in the middle of a field in Kansas, a farmer's field. He was convinced that she was a Japanese fighter pilot that was there to hurt him, and so he chased her all around the field with a pitchfork until she could convince him otherwise. Unfortunately, Hazel died November 25th, 1944, in a terrible runway collision in Montana. Sadder still, her brother, who was also in the armed forces, died in combat 3 days later. They're buried next to each other in the Riverview Cemetery in Portland. Now, Hazel and the rest of her crew were recognized by Jimmy Carter, and then they were given the Congressional Gold Medal in 2010 from President Barack Obama. I couldn't wait to think about how great it would be to meet her. How would it be to learn from her unflinching courage and her determination at a time when both her gender and race were barriers that she broke through? All of the pictures, she has such grace and she showed such resilience. I loved learning about her story, and she's still one of my favorite Oregonians in history. Similarly, I love the story of Laura Stockton Starcher. She is the nation's first female mayor from Umatilla, actually. Now, the story of how she became the mayor is the good part. Previous to that, her husband was the mayor, and he and his friends ran Umatilla kind of like their own private club. They would play cards wherever they wanted, and they didn't pay the light bill, and they didn't change the lights in the street lights outside, and they wouldn't pay for the garbage to be taken out outside, so they just kind of didn't care. And people were getting fed up. So one day, shortly before the election, Laura had a tea party with many of her friends, influential friends in town. There she organized a tea party coup where they got their husbands, because of course they couldn't vote, to vote for Laura instead of her husband. And by the day after the election, he found out that he didn't win, but his wife did. And I'm sure you're also not surprised to find out that they didn't stay married for too long after that. But she showed such determination and really tried very hard to turn the town around. She and her friends, which then became the city council, had kind of a short reign, but they did a lot during their short term. And I'd love to talk to her about the challenges she faced as a trailblazing woman in politics long before women had a strong voice in the political arena. And also similarly, Mary talked a little bit about about Fern Hobbs. I didn't know too much about her, and I was just so delighted to learn that Governor West sent Fern Hobbs to dismantle the lawless town of Copperfield, Oregon. Armed with nothing more than her strong will and the governor's authority, she faced down an entire town of troublemakers. The small town of Copperfield, Oregon, had become infamous for its rampant corruption, illegal activity, and flagrant disregard for the law. Copperfield, which is in Baker County, experienced a boom in population that was due to the mining and railroad industries. But, like many of those towns, with the economic growth came the usual problems associated with those boom towns: saloons and gambling and crime. But Copperfield was largely controlled by those saloon keepers and officials who turned a blind eye to the activities. The illegal liquor trade flourished, and the violence and lawlessness was interesting because the local officials actively participated in the chaos at times. Enter Fern Hobbs. She was a determined secretary with a mission. She was no ordinary secretary. She had studied law, and though she had never practiced it formally, she was well versed in the legal system and in politics. At just 32 years old, she'd already become Governor West's trusted confidant and right-hand woman in his administration. So when he chose her to march into Copperfield and clean up the mess, it was a bold statement, not only to the criminals, but to the entire state. Hobbs didn't go alone, though. She arrived in Copperfield accompanied by a detachment of the Oregon National Guard. This wasn't just a peaceful visit, it was a declaration of martial law. Copperfield had really never seen anything like it. A woman, unarmed, marching at the head of these soldiers, representing the full power of the state government. I would love to have seen that. Now, she's quoted in several places, including the Oregonian, as saying this, and I don't know if it's true, but gosh, I hope it is. She is quoted as saying, "You have 24 hours to resign, or this town will be placed under martial law. I am here on the governor's orders, and this lawlessness ends today. Armed? Well, yes, I am. I have a dressing bag, a portfolio, and an umbrella. I don't believe I could do much damage with those." The town's officials were caught off guard. They initially all refused, but she wasn't bluffing. She ordered the militia to seize all of the saloons and shut down the illegal activities in Copperfield. I don't know if they saw her determination or if they saw the soldiers behind her shoulders, but they began to resign one by one. Now, after this triumph, she continued to work in public service. After her mission was done, she worked in Oregon with Governor West, of course, but then she worked later for the US government in Washington, D.C., and then she went on to the American Red Cross and came back to Oregon to work for the Oregon Journal. Absolutely, just very florid journalism. They talked about his expressions and every moment of the trial. It's actually quite a treat to read if you're ever interested in Oregon newspapers. It's funny, it's very vivid. You can really imagine everything that happened in the courtroom. And he was, of course, convicted after a long trial and also put to death. I'm really glad because he seems like he was the kind of just ruthless criminal that really wouldn't stop at much, so I'm sure glad he didn't stick around. The next person that I'm glad I didn't miss is actually kind of related to Sheriff Withers. His name's Henry Day. Henry Day was a deputy of Sheriff Withers, and in 1889, he was not only a deputy, he was a part-time bookkeeper. On October 22nd of 1889, Sheriff Withers got to the sheriff's department to find that the department's insurance fund for the year was gone, and so was Henry Day. The amount of money at the time was $2,100, so this was collected over the year and was ready to be turned in for all of the department. That is, in today's money, $80,000. The crazy thing was that Henry completely disappeared. I mean, you could do that back then, but he had one sighting where he was seen in Portland a day later or so, and his wife was interviewed and knew nothing about it. But the interesting thing is that prior to that, Henry Day had been a very revered man. He was in the Knights of Pythias, and he was in the Elks and all of the fraternal organizations and had good standing as a deputy. Nobody knew what wall this fell off of, basically. But they couldn't find him. And even Sheriff Withers, who was so determined and just like a dog with a bone, he found so many other criminals, but couldn't find Henry Day. Sheriff Withers was so disturbed about this that he repaid the money from his own wages. He garnished his own wages until it was all paid off. Wow. They didn't find hide nor hair of Henry Day until 4 years later in Comstock, California. Now, this is very cinematic. He was recognized at the Comstock train station by a train agent who actually used to work at the train agency in Eugene. And the train agent tells it that they locked eyes, and Henry Day was disguised with a big hat, but the train agent still knew it was him. So they locked eyes, and then very much like a movie, Henry Day walks off as quickly and unobtrusively as he can to the train that was going the furthest away at the time and the very last car. And it was something like the train agent was like, wait, I know that guy. And then as soon as he came to it in his head, he was chasing him and the train was gone. So he escaped again. And of course, the train agent called Sheriff Withers and they tried to find him, but there was no clue about where he went. I mean, they knew that the train's last stop was going to Reno, but after that, they had just really no idea. So I was kind of unsatisfied with that answer. I still don't know the truth, but I did a ton of research. I do a lot of research in genealogy and cemetery records because they're kind of a treasure trove for both records, photographs, and people to contact who might know stuff about the person whom you're researching. I found things to indicate that Henry Jackson Day, which actually was our Henry Day's middle name, had returned to Oregon in 1925. He married a widow in Eugene in 1926 and lived a quiet life until his death in 1927. There was no record under the name Henry Day, but only under Henry Jackson Day, known as Jackson Day. I was able to contact some relatives of the Henry Jackson Day who had come back and was married, and they didn't know the answer. They just were like, no, this is my, relative, and we only knew that he married our great-great-grandmother, Elizabeth. So we have no idea if he ever paid back the money, if it was him, why he came back. Did he come back because Sheriff Withers had already repaid the money? And by that time, Sheriff Withers was gone, so it was kind of a moot point. There was nothing. In all of these gossipy newspapers and in every report that I read, they didn't say anything. So I think it was him. All of the numbers match up. All of the relatives match up. But I really want to know where he went. What happened to the money? Was it really him? And why did he come back? I just think that's a very incredible mystery. And it's also nice because it shows another side of Sheriff Withers, whom I think I'm going to write a whole bunch of books about because he just takes my fancy. I really am so interested in these people in Oregon's past. All of the people in Oregon's past that we know about linger in their extraordinary lives, the evidence of that. They're filled with courage and innovation. Others have tragedy and loss, of course, but whether we wish we could have met them or are grateful we didn't, their stories continue to shape our understanding of history. And I always find that I learn more about the time period by learning about the people, because people are people, no matter what time period. We all have the same kinds of motivations. And history then feels like a living force that's full of lessons and warnings and inspiration for the future. That's my last story. Do you guys have any questions? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. We'll begin our question and answer period with Jennifer in just a moment, but first I'd like to thank the business and in-kind sponsors whose support helps to make City Club possible. Thank you to our gold sponsors, the Network Charter School, Hudson Dental, Luvis Cobb, and the Lane Transit District. Thank you also to our in-kind sponsors, KRVM 91.9 Radio, Dotson's Photography, Pack Info, and Kid Sports. Also a special thank you to our award-winning public radio station, KLCC FM 89.7, for airing City Club programs Monday nights at 7 p.m. For those listening at home and in the car right now, your household is one of several thousand tuning into City Club on KLCC, and we love that you're here. You can find all recent City Club programs archived on KLCC, as well as on our YouTube channel and as podcasts. We'll take a brief break before returning with questions. Thank you. back to the City Club of Eugene. We'll now start our question and answer session on our program, Ghosts of Oregon's History. Mary, you have the first question.
I'm Mary Layton. I'm City Club member and a former principal. So I feel obliged to tell you that the ghoulish objects on your tables tonight have been brought here from the art students at Mecca, where Network Charter students do their art. And yes, and the treats are brought to you by City Club of Eugene. And unfortunately, we have all raided the Snickers. The Snickers are gone. But my question for Jennifer is, what would you tell students? Like, we talked a little bit about your education, and you did go to a writing workshop, and you're picking your way through an undergraduate degree, but clearly that has not stopped you from being an avid pursuer of your passion for local history. I would be grateful for your thoughts on how do you help a young person give themselves permission to be very serious about something that might not look, at least at first, like a job, but that is in fact real work that communities are happy to have done, as your work is?
I think, well, that's a great question, thank you. I was very lucky because I grew up in a household that encouraged learning in every possible way, and I try to do that for myself, and I think that learning for learning's sake is okay. I think it's okay to follow your passions. I learned to podcast because I was fascinated by it and I just really wanted to do it. I haven't finished my college degree because I don't need it to do what I do. I think it's really important to keep pursuing the things that you love. They may not always make money, but that's not always the point. I think that it's more important to do things that enrich your soul and make you feel great. And hopefully also be of value to yourself and your community. But always follow the things that bring you joy, I think is short answer.
Jennifer, my name is Mike Grudzy, and I'm a City Club member. And first, thank you so much for your presentation. It's well researched, very good. Kind of have a general and broad question. Do we, in the whole state, and you might not be aware, but statewide, have any kind of really big ghost story that goes beyond the borders? Maybe some famous ghost in a Pittock mansion or something? Any other stories you might be aware of? So it's kind of a question, but almost a request if you got another ghost story.
Well, that's a great question. I don't have tons of ghost stories, just because they're hard to verify, but there's always the ghost of the Pittock Mansion is a good one that you mentioned, but everyone is hopefully familiar with the ghost of the lighthouse in Florence. It's a wonderful story. As many ghosts of lighthouses are, there was a woman who was scorned and threw herself off the top, if I remember correctly. And you can stay, I believe, again, in the lighthouse in Florence, and they say that you can still hear her at night, and you can feel cold spots, and sometimes in the pictures, I've seen the pictures online where there's orbs. So if I would research that one a little bit more, I think. And there's a lot of different kinds of ghosts in Oregon. A lot of them are pioneers, which is great. And there's a lot of minor ghosts. There's one in eastern Oregon, in the Wallowas, maybe it's in the Wallowas. And it's a hotel that is supposed to be extremely haunted by both the natives that lived there and by the minor ghosts that were present nearby also, and same kinds of experiences. Cold spots are very common from what I understand. There's so many great ghost stories in Oregon. I don't have too many particulars, but those are a couple that I can think of. Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much. It was a fun and interesting presentation. I'm curious about how you do your research, and particularly now with the internet and historic societies and libraries. So if we see a portrait of an old sheriff, or if we have a mystery in the family, how would you recommend starting the research?
Well, if you have that's a great question. Unfortunately, the research is my favorite part, so I often get lost in the research. The best place, I think, if you have a family story, for instance, is to, mine your family for any kind of information you can get there. And if there's any documents, any letters, things like that. But really, I think that historical societies, local historical societies, are one of your best resources. They have so many things surrounding, if your ancestor was a pioneer, you can find out everything about the pioneers in that area, and you can find out about, all what wagon train they were on and things of that nature to really fill out your story. Even if you don't know the particulars, you could find out all around it. I also do a lot of research through Oregon historical newspapers, although they're skewed, and of course they're always, you have to take it with a grain of salt, but they're a really good resource for how the community felt at the time. You can read about the same incident, Sheriff Withers' death, for instance. You can read about it in the Register Guard, and you can also read about it in the Condon Review, and they have different points of view, so you get different threads to pull on. I really like historic newspapers for that. I think that's my favorite. So museums and newspapers are my favorite. And of course, if you can get any sort of source material, letters are great for that. I've done those. Thank you. That's a good question.
Andrew Kallick, City Club. I was a history major in college, so this was a great sort of presentation. Maybe want to go back to school. One of my favorite classes in school was a course taught by Laurel Thatcher Ulrich, and the entire class was about her book, which was based on a diary of a midwife in Maine. It won the Pulitzer Prize, and instead of being the great man theory of history, we studied history through this diary. And I've thought about how that person who wrote the diary never thought that it would be a historical artifact. She was, not, I'm sure in her mind, a historical figure. She was writing a diary. And most of us are not historical figures. And yet it is fascinating to look back as you have and discover these stories. So my question is, how do we, as human beings in this world, make sure that there is something that someone like you can look back on 100 years from now, especially in the age of text messaging and email, something worth, looking at to understand how we lived, and how we flowed through history, I suppose. Thank you.
Ooh, I like that. I would say, firstly, one of the interesting things about diaries and things like that is that they are maybe not necessarily true, quote unquote, but they are a true experience of that person. And that's valuable, that's worth a lot. So I think actually, I know that they're archiving the entire internet, so we won't have to worry about saving that for posterity. That actually already is archived and is being updated instantly every day. But I think that the story of a place is told often in its objects. The things that you spoke of a female perspective, a lot of the story of places is shown by the things that they used to cook their meals, the things that they used to heat their homes and the places and the ways that they lived. And also, I think stories can be remembered by the art that people decide to revere and remember. All different kinds of art, writing and theater and classical art, of course. I mean, you can pick your poison, which kind you love, but I think that paying attention to the things that the society thought was important at the time would answer that question the best. Thank you.
Joel Curran, City Club member. What's next for you? What are you studying, or what do you want to study?
I'm writing another book that is based on the coroner's files. So I spoke about it just a little bit, but Robin had found a box of these previously unseen, and I mean, what an incredible gift to get for me. It was just amazing. You can read about the way these people died tells you so much about how they lived. And I have so many more stories to tell about them and different experiences from Eugene's history and Lane County's history. I got to one of the great things about writing this kinds of stuff is because I do pull those threads, and one of my cases is about a man who was electrocuted because he pulled on one of the large arc lights when they were downtown in Eugene, and because of that, they had to change the laws and the ways that they treated electricity. And so it's kind of like you're watching history unfold in real time that way. So I like to write fiction, and I love to do podcasting. I have a couple of new seasons of my podcast coming up, but more than anything, I want to go back to these people. Thank you.
So I'm going back to the young people, because one of my volunteer gigs is helping them apply for their next life in high school. So how did you get started? I mean, you woke up one morning and said, "Oh, I think I'm going to do local history." How did this happen?
Actually, so you spoke a little bit about I have a brain injury, and after I recovered from that, I went to several different colleges trying to figure out what worked for me. But the one thing I always wanted to do was tell my story, because I hadn't, at the time, there wasn't any literature about people who had brain injuries surviving and how they might have done so. So I wrote my first book about, it was fictionalized, but it was about my story and I did a bunch of research with other people who were brain injured because I wanted to know what their experiences were, and I wrote that down, and that didn't satisfy the itch. Afterwards, I looked at my own community, and where I was living at the time, there was a small literary magazine that was taking applications, and I had young kids, and I thought, that's something that I can do. I can work at that speed. And so I started submitting to this literary magazine that came out quarterly. It's called Groundwaters Magazine. And then eventually I started submitting more and more. And a lot of the focus of the magazine was on it was all on local people's writing. And a lot of their experiences were historical. So it really was interesting in that respect. And eventually I got to help edit their stories and speak with the people who were telling them, and write some more of them myself. So then eventually it kind of snowballed. And I'm lucky enough to be able to go to a lot of writers' events. One of my friends, Bill Sullivan, is a historical writer, and I thought, why shouldn't I? I should try it. And I was very lucky. The first one I submitted, they accepted, and then they kept wanting me to write more. So I keep writing more. I think the important thing, especially, and I guess that is circular, but going back to kids, I think that's following the thing that lights me up. I love reading about people because I think they're endlessly fascinating. And I want to understand why they do what they do. So I write about it. I'll let you know when I get the answer, but I don't have it yet.
You mentioned the Lane County History Museum, which for our audience is open Thursdays through Saturdays. It's at the fairgrounds. It's free. You should go check it out. It's a wonderful museum.
Yes.
Where else should folks go to get their fingers into great archival material about local history and learn more of these stories that you've unearthed, if you've inspired them, which I'm sure you have?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked that, because I was so lucky. One of my first historical books, I was writing about Abigail Scott Duniway, and I was trying to find a lot of her material. And I was intermittently a student at the U of O, and I was able to talk to the archival library department, and they have her actual overland diary that you can hold in your hands. And I was just stunned that I could take 3 hours of my life and go upstairs at the library and they would just give it to me. I'm just some random person and I could just read. You couldn't really read it. Her handwriting is pretty spidery, but that's what they had to do. There was so many of her materials there at the university. So universities are also a great location all over. There's any community organization will probably be able to give you a little bit of that. But universities are incredible, and I was so lucky to be able to be in the right place at the right time. And similarly, I got to hold and read a whole bunch of items from Ursula Le Guin. And I just felt like the luckiest person on the planet that I got to be with these historical things in person.
I'll keep peppering you with questions. Why not?
Okay.
It's a history guy. I can't help it. I grew up in Massachusetts, and thinking back on the history that I learned growing up, I realized just how much of it was sort of locally based. I grew up on the North Shore of Boston, and we learned all about the witch trials, for instance, in deep ways, I think because it was local. To what extent do you think that this type of local history, can and should be emphasized in our public school education? And of course, because you got to learn lots of different things, but how should we be telling these tales to our young people moving forward?
I get to go speak to a lot of schools, which is one of the things I like a lot, particularly about my historical stuff. And I think it's incredibly important because it gives you a sense of place. It gives you a sense of the roots where you come from. I think that all students should know that they're on Kalapuya land, and I think that all that live here, I think they should know the sacrifices that people made to get here where we are today. And I think that in some classes it's been really fun. I've been able to, I really very much appreciate the Artists in Residence program, because having people come and speak to classrooms and doing projects with kids where they can do historical based, they can do their own research, they can, on a very small scale, they don't have to do giant books about it, but something that they're interested in. And it can be, I know that some of the books I write are based on crime, and that's too salacious for some, but that might really hook a high school kid into being really interested in the fact that, Oregon has one of the highest percentage of serial killers in the United States. Like, that's a good thing to know. And it might make them want to learn more about some other aspect of that. Or, learning something about, sometimes I get to go talk about pioneers and do things like talk about the toys that they had, and having kids like build their own toys in a younger classroom. That would be on that. I think you have to be really creative with that, but I think that's one of the cool things about history is that there's so much to pick from.
Well, speaking of records, I happened to be driving past Westernport, Maryland one day on my way back to DC from someplace, and I stopped at the Catholic Church and said, I think my grandma's family is from here. Wow. Do you have anything from Logston? And Flanagan. And she said, oh yeah, just a minute. And she went to the safe in the rectory, pulled out the original records from the middle 1800s, and showed me the entry where her birth was recorded. So I'm thinking, okay, so maybe not so much in Oregon, but certainly back east. If people came from back east, you could do that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. Also, but even here in Oregon, the Roundtable Club has records kept in the university archives. And what you can discover is that 100 years ago, people from the town and the gown were still complaining about the same things they're complaining about now. They have elaborately developed interesting papers. So to second your emotion, that the university, an old university anyway, can be a repository. Now, in the Roundtable Club interest, they're only guys' papers. They didn't allow women in until 20 years, 30 years ago. But still, there's lots of places, clubs and churches.
Oh, that's a really good resource, yes. Yeah. And also similarly, and I should have said this, city records. You can't always get them. Sometimes you have to apply for them. Sometimes you have to have a reason or pay a couple of dollars. But if there is a building that you're studying because you want to know the history of the people who live there, you can go look at the plans. You can easily do that. You can find birth and death records. And a lot of that's available online. So you have to be a little bit crafty about where you find them. I think and I didn't think about churches would be a great place to look.
My friend wrote the whole history of the economic life of 15th century women in England by looking at church records in Oxford.
Oh, I want to read that. Thank you. That's a great question.
That's all the time we have for today. Please join me in thanking Jennifer. This has been our October 25th, 2024 conversation at the City Club of Eugene, the Ghosts of Oregon's History. If you couldn't tell by the topic today and the skulls on the tables, yes, next week is Halloween, and that means lots of fun community activities for trick-or-treaters of all ages. That starts with the city's celebration tomorrow, Saturday the 26th, from 1 to 6 p.m. downtown. The YMCA in South Eugene also hosting a trick-or-treating festival on Halloween itself in the early evening. So check out those activities with your goblins of choice. City Club is back next Friday with our latest in a series about Eugene's economy. This one will be focused on the tech economy of the region, so I look forward to seeing you then. Thanks for joining us. Have a great weekend. Thanks, Jennifer. It was fun.
Thanks, this is really fun. I appreciate being here. Thank you.
Absolutely.
That's cool. I would totally come to this if I lived in town. I would come here all the time.